rights for all Americans, particularly the one that began with African Americans. If you look at the center of your screen, you'll see a political cartoon that was meant to describe or symbolize the idea of what was called the Brown versus Board of Education case. If you notice some of the symbolic ideas in this cartoon, it's very significant in explaining the ideas of social movements in general, particularly those for civil rights and those for people of color in the United States. You'll notice the white hands using the nail and hammer to break the shackles off of a person of color that are handcuffed over what is the anvil. The idea is that this is symbolizing by the artist the idea that they were trying to break the shackle by unsegregating or desegregating the school system. However, what you will notice is that the chain is not breaking. And this was very significant because while this Supreme Court decision started to crack away at a lot of the civil injustices that segregation had created, it was not breaking it. It wasn't ending it. This is a very valuable cartoon because in the historical perspective, it shows that somebody at this time period was recognizing that the Supreme Court decision was not changing American history. It was starting to change. The limitation is that the artists themselves is, some people who maybe work for the NAACP, African Americans in the South, they may have seen it differently. So there is a limitation on that perspective, that there is some bias here, that whoever created this cartoon was not doing it with the intention of basically arguing that there was no change. There definitely was a change from Brown versus Board, and a much greater change than America had ever seen. So a lot of this comes as a result of the post-war world. A big part of what we're going to focus on is this idea of segregation. And segregation basically is the forced separation of different racial groups. It can also be different ethnic groups or racial, beyond racial, religious groups. So segregation itself was specifically in the United States based on race, mostly in the southern U.S., where we had this idea of de jure versus de facto segregation. And we'll get into more specifics about that. But a big part of what we're going to look at is the idea of, well, how are these laws enforced? And this is a video or a picture which many of you have probably seen before, that ordinances typically in communities were enforced where they separated the things as simple as the water fountain. And what you'll notice in this picture is not only the nameplates of white versus colored, but you would have a different product of what you were using. The one on the left is one that is refrigerated. It's colder. It's a little bit nicer. The one on the right, obviously older, scratched up, not refrigerated. And typically this kind of symbolized the idea of what segregation was. The white things were better than those that were for people of color. And that went beyond just water fountains. It included the idea of schools, buses, living quarters, neighborhoods, everything. And what you need to think about when you think about segregation is the basically imbalance that was created in every aspect of life. So the civil rights movement for all Americans, the basic idea of equality, was really spearheaded by African Americans. And we see this in the 1950s after World War II, when different organizations begin to form like CORE or the SNCC or the SCLC, where strong Black leaders start to enforce or fight for these different types of movements to change the laws of our country. Now, some did them very specifically peacefully, like the SCLC, which was under the leadership of Martin Luther King, and some did them with a little bit more violence in their nature, but not necessarily actually violent, with the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. And then we had the Black Panthers, who came about a little bit later in time, in the late 60s and early 70s, when some frustration grew over the lack of the ability of organizations to really change things. Now, when we get into the idea of change, we have to look at the leaders. When we look at the big names here, the Kings, the X's, the Rosa Parks, the Thurgood Marshalls, these are people who started the idea of change. It's these little names that kind of played the role along the way that really caused the change. And I think it's interesting because a lot of these smaller names you might not recognize, but these people like Linda Brown, who was the person or the young woman in Brown versus the Board of Education, Elizabeth Eckford, who was one of the Little Rock Nine that went and desegregated the schools, Medgar Evers, James Meredith, the older black males who desegregated universities in the South. And then the more significant names of like the JFK and the LBJ are presidents who actually changed the laws. These are very significant leaders in the civil rights movement. And then we have the court decisions. And these are the things that about, I think, the United States that we don't recognize. This is how the change happens. In our country, we are based on laws. It's not until laws are made, things like the Voting Rights Acts or the Civil Rights Acts, that change the laws, or the Supreme Court decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson or Brown versus the Board of Education that start the change to say, hey, this law is wrong. We don't have change. Socially, we stay pretty the same as long as we can until our federal government or state governments make these decisions. Now, it's interesting because when we look at the Voting Rights Act, we'll actually see how sometimes those laws, while changing for good, can have some pretty interesting unintended consequences along the way, like gerrymandering. And then finally, we'll look at some events like the Selma March, the idea of Birmingham, marches on Washington, like that with MLK, the idea of the Freedom Riders, and then we'll kind of see how the civil rights movement takes kind of a negative turn when we go from sit-ins and peaceful marches to riots. A specific part of some of our ideas are going to focus on how Martin Luther King was very different from Malcolm X. We'll start with the idea of Rosa Parks and how her role really began the civil rights movement in the perspective of civil disobedience. And we'll compare that to Malcolm X's role and what was significant about that. I want you to just take a couple minutes, though, to listen to some specific presentations that define the idea of who MLK was versus Malcolm X.
We will be able to transform the jangling discord of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all the God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country tears of thee." Sweet land of liberty and be our sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrims cry. From every mountainside, let freedom reign. If America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom reign. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom reign. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom reign. From the hiking Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom reign. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom reign. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom reign from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom reign from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom reign from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside.
gentlemen, we want to talk about the ballot or the bullet. The ballot or the bullet explains itself. Before we get into it, since this is the year of the ballot or the bullet, I would like to clarify some things that refer to me personally concerning my own personal position. I'm still a Muslim. That is, my religion is still Islam. My religion is still Islam. I still credit Mr. Muhammad for what I know and what I am. He's the one who opened my eyes. At present, I'm the minister of the newly founded Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which has its offices in the Teresa Hotel right in the heart of Harlem. That's the Black Belt in New York City. And when we realize that Adam Clayton Powell is a Christian minister, he has Abyssinia Baptist Church, but at the same time he's more famous for his political struggle. And Dr. King is a Christian minister from Atlanta, Georgia, or in Atlanta, Georgia, but he's become more famous for being involved in the civil rights struggle. There's another in New York, Reverend Galamison. I don't know if you've heard of him out here. He's a Christian minister from Brooklyn, but has become famous for his fight against the segregated school system in Brooklyn. Reverend Cleave, right here, is a Christian minister here in Detroit. He's the head of the Freedom Now Party. All of these are Christian ministers. All of these are Christian ministers, but they don't come to us as Christian ministers. They come to us as fighters in some other category. I'm a Muslim minister. The same as they are Christian ministers, I'm a Muslim minister. And I don't believe in fighting today in any one front, but on all fronts. In fact, I'm a black nationalist freedom fighter. Islam is my religion, but I believe my religion is my personal business. It governs my personal life, my personal morals, and my religious philosophy is personal between me and the God in whom I believe, just as the religious philosophy of these others is between them and the God in whom they believe. And this is best this way. Were we to come out here discussing religion, we'd have too many differences from the outside, and we could never get together. So today, though Islam is my religious philosophy, my political, economic, and social philosophy is black nationalism. You and I...
So a big part of what both MLK and Malcolm X were arguing for was a change in laws that gave equality for all Americans, so that there was no more manipulation of white politicians to control non-white people. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, very specifically, were talking about black men and in the ideas of their religions, which kind of got entangled in this. Some other groups were ignored often in the civil rights movement. But we're going to talk a lot more about those specific groups, including Latin Americans, specifically Mexican Americans in the Southwest, Native Americans who really were given no rights but had been here first, women, both black, white, brown, every woman who was disenfranchised all the way up through the 1920s. And then also look at ideas of how American groups started to fight for their rights, like people who were disabled, different groups who basically saw their civil liberties being ignored, like the LGBT community. And then we're also going to look at people that were kind of viewed as the counterculture that used a lot of these civil rights and voting rights acts to try to enforce new ideas in our government. That's going to come a little bit later. But we are going to want to specifically look at this Voting Rights Act because we're eventually going to get into a big discussion about how laws sometimes can be formed, but however, they may not follow through with their intentions. And this will become significant when we look at the difference of what segregation was in America, the difference that can be defined by what Martin Luther King was fighting against, which was de jure segregation in the South, where we had actual laws passed that specifically said whites here, non-white here, versus de facto segregation, where it was an act of culture. And we can see what Malcolm X was fighting against was specifically that, and things like redlining that happened, where the banks and government agencies specifically created non-white neighborhoods in major cities, and then eventually the idea of white flight when more black neighborhoods were created by the government. And so there was this white and non-white area or stores or restaurants that didn't have a sign on it, but you just knew you didn't go there. And it got as gray area as you could, where it was if you were a non-white person in a part of a park, you would maybe necessarily not see a sign, but you would have most likely somebody, a police officer, come and tell you you should not be here. And if you refused, there would be violence. And so that's kind of the idea of where we're going to end up here with this idea of civil rights before we then move on into the other groups of people who start to fight for social. Finally, we'll end up closing the civil rights movement and kind of transferring into the idea of social movements. And that will come with a discussion of kind of what is viewed as the end of the civil rights movement for African Americans, when in 1968, a lot of these laws that had been passed seem to not being followed through, or there is a very big conflict as they are starting to be enforced. And this is explicitly looked at as a tumultuous year when King is assassinated. There is violence that takes over many of the city streets as people start to see a lot of that frustration with King's assassination. And then ultimately the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, during his move to run for the presidency and take over for Lyndon Baines Johnson, who decides in 1968 to not run for office. All of this leads to a very significant time period, 1968, the summer of 68, where we see the Democratic National Convention. There is a riot that occurs outside of the movement to choose our president. And ultimately, a lot of people kind of see this as a symbolic turning point in the social movements and the civil rights movement.